An award-winning journalist and TV producer, fascinated by the political landscape of the MENA region, he met with world leaders and knows about their stories. Amjad Tadros, producer of 60 Minutes on CBS, is our next guest here in Now House, Amman, Jordan.
Amjad, it's great to have you here at the Now House in Amman and to have you on set of MENA on the Map. You stated in your Facebook bio that you are a news producer, but also you are passionate about eating without gaining weight. This is something I think both Philip and I are interested in, but for later. Now we'll focus more on your work as a news producer. We named this episode, I Saw Saddam. Amjad, you saw Saddam. How can you describe your encounter and what are your impressions on Iraq through this man?
Well, I saw Saddam in very extraordinary circumstances. And, in most of these countries where, you have a dictatorship, Saddam was everywhere. If you go to Iraq, from the moment you land in the country, his picture is everywhere. On the streets, there are statues of him. There are pictures at the airport. So wherever you go, Saddam is there. But if you ask an ordinary Iraqi, have you ever really seen Saddam for real? The most likely answer would be no. So he's omnipresent, yet nobody has seen him. And I was one of the very few people who actually got to see him face to face. And it was in a very particular, peculiar circumstances, whereby it was January 17th, 1993, and it was the third anniversary of the Gulf War. And on that day, Saddam decided to give a speech, as usual. So he was on television giving a speech, and part of my job was to sit and listen to the speech. And lo and behold, I fell asleep on the floor watching the speech of Saddam Hussein. And I was lucky enough because I like to sit on the floor usually, I don't know why. And so I was sitting on the floor underneath the window at the Rashid Hotel in Baghdad. And suddenly I fell asleep and I woke up on a loud voice and light, and it was actually an American cruise missile hitting the hotel.
Wow.
And I was so lucky to survive. Because I was sleeping next to the window, so the glass flew on top of my head. So I looked at myself and I had blood on my leg, and I was like, oh shit, I'm going to die. I would love to say shit.
You can say whatever. Yeah.
So, and I was the only one at that time in the CBS News office in Baghdad, because most of all of my crew were somewhere else. And so what I did was just looked at the blood, and there was chaos. And the one thing you don't see on television when in such a situation is the smell. Because the missile just hit the hotel, and there's a smell of gunpowder, whatever it is. Yeah. And we were so lucky that the missile itself, the warhead did not explode. It just hit the garden. So I decided I have to do something about it. So I rolled myself out, and I go into the hallway, and I was screaming for people to come and help me. And somebody showed up, and they said, okay, come with us. So I took off my pants. So I was wearing a t-shirt, my underpants, and a pair of socks, or actually one sock. And then I looked at my leg. It was okay. It wasn't, it was just, shrapnel. That piece of glass went into my leg. So they told me, come downstairs. So I actually jumped from the 8th floor to the ground floor of the hotel on one leg, and went down to the hotel lobby. And I think I wrapped myself with a towel. And then suddenly they said, okay, no, you have to come with us. Like, where? To the hospital. Like, no, I don't want to go to the hospital. Can you treat me here? So anyway, they shoved me into a van, and they drove me through the streets of Baghdad, and still the air raid was going on, and they took me to the hospital. And then they said, oh, it's fine, you're okay, just, sleep now. I said, no, I don't want to sleep. I want to go and tell people my crew, because people knew that the hotel was hit. And I just told them that I'm alive, because what's going to happen is they're going to come to the hotel, and suddenly they're going to see the blood all over the room, and I wasn't there, so they assume I was dead. And they said, no, sleep now, later. was like, okay, no. And then I was like trying, can you please call them at least? And then suddenly they said, okay, we'll take you out. So after they stitched me, and they put me in a wheelchair, and I thought I was going to leave the hospital. At that time, I was in my just underpants, one sock, and a t-shirt. And suddenly I realized that I'm being pushed inside the hospital rather than being taken outside. I was like screaming, like, I want to go home, go home. I said no. So they took me into this ward that had like 6 beds, and this is where they put the wounded people from the hotel. So they locked us in, and I was like, I was screaming, like, this is not real. And suddenly, a group of doctors showed up, and then they basically shoved us off the beds, and they started putting new bed sheets on the sheet, and then they changed our dressings, our wounds, and then somebody came in and they put all these charts with our names on top of the beds. I was like, something is going on now, and then suddenly the door opens, and then when the door opens, we see flashlights coming in. And I recognized the face of Saddam's private bodyguard that I always see on television. Like, what is this? And then suddenly Saddam shows up. And with the cameras and the doctors, and he was basically coming to the hospital to check on the wounded. And of course he wasn't coming to check on the wounded, but it was the Iraqi way of showing the world that Saddam is still alive. Now he's visiting the wounded. Yeah. And we were just the props in this game. And he came in, and he started walking around the ward, and I was like the second or the third in line. So I had like 3 minutes to decide what to tell him. And I decided to play the shocked journalist and just thanked him for coming to visit me, which is the proper thing to do, because you don't want to make a political statement, because it's not our job to make political statements, but you're expected to say something, right? Yes. So I just said, okay, thank you very much for coming visiting me, blah, blah, blah. And then, then he showed up next to my bed, and somebody said, oh, Your Excellency, this guy's Jordanian. He's giving us a hard time because he wants to go home. And so I said, so Saddam looked at me and said, like, you have to listen to the doctor's orders. I was like, okay, I'm not going anywhere. I'm staying here now. And so, I think we exchanged a couple of sentences, and he left. I mean, that was my encounter with Saddam. And it's somewhere on YouTube, by the way. And and then, of course, they took my picture, and the next day I was the headlines in all the Iraqi newspaper, like, this Iraqi Jordanian guy visited by Saddam. And then they realized I was like working for American television, and then they start putting, and the journalist Amjad Tadros said so and so. I didn't say anything. I just, this is what I said. But I became famous. That day in Iraq, everybody came to shake hands with me.
Wow.
Okay, because by the time Saddam left, they just, our drivers came, they found me, and they took me home, right? They took us to a different hotel because our hotel was devastated at that night. But, I became famous, and, people just made fun of me because that was my 15 minutes of fame.
Yeah.
And because I met Saddam. But I got out of this whole meeting, I got a picture of me in the hospital bed in my underwear, t-shirt, and sock, meeting with Saddam. And I used to save this on my Palm Pilot. We used to have Palm Pilots, before the cell phones arrived. And that allowed me for a long time to work in Iraq unchallenged. Why? Because people thought that this guy knows Saddam. And basically, I met Saddam for like 2 minutes, but I had the picture. And every year, every January 17, Saddam used to send me a gift. And the gift used to come from the presidential palace in Iraq. Remember, Iraq was a very strict police state, and they had a system that worked. So the gift would come from the presidential palace, because I was on some sort of a list. And then they send it down to the Minister of Information. Of course, it comes to the minister's office. And then the minister has to send it down to the press center where we used to work. And when I was not in Iraq, they used to send it to the embassy in Amman, to the ambassador, and the ambassador would send it to the media guy. And they had to actually deliver it to me and show proof that I received, that I got the gift. So it was like, nobody can mess up with these things. So the whole process of me getting the gift, was very elaborate. And the people at the Ministry of Information always said, like, oh, this guy is getting a gift from Saddam, he must be important. And so for years, I worked in Iraq. You remember, I was working for American television, which is technically the enemy. And nobody challenged me in Iraq. In fact, they always avoided dealing with me because they thought I was linked to Saddam. And that allowed me to work in Iraq for years, till 2003, till the regime fell, unchallenged, and we made, the most groundbreaking stories in Iraq, and all the other journalists, Iraqis and foreigners used to look like, why is this guy getting all this access? And not knowing that they're just afraid of me.
When you saw Saddam Hussein end, when he was about to be executed, what feelings did you have?
I was in the US actually when it happened. It was sad. I never liked Saddam, by the way. I wasn't like a fan of Saddam. Saddam was a dictator and he's responsible for a lot of problems in Iraq till today. And which is something that, for years in Iraq, you could not even express your point of view. And I shouldn't be anyway, but I was never a fan of Saddam. But, Saddam basically was my job. That's what I did. I covered Iraq from 1990 to 2006, and 13 years of which Saddam was in charge. So I used to watch his speeches, to translate things he says, understand, stuff like that. And don't forget, CBS News, we got the last interview with Saddam Hussein, just before the war, and that was, one of the things I managed to get. So for me, he was my job. This the raison d'être, as you say in French, so yes, but yeah, I think the way he was executed and the way the whole thing was done was kind of tasteless, and somebody had to break the cycle of violence in Iraq, and by them executing him in this way and filming it as well and leaking the videos and so on, it was just, I knew that this just would be another episode that would lead to more and more violence, which is sad, So I wasn't very happy about the whole thing that was done.
Besides Saddam's story, which is very exciting, and some people, by the way, were saying that he showed bravery during the execution.
Totally.
So it reflects how his personality was.
Totally. Saddam, many people, say what Saddam says and stuff like that, but very few people actually knew. I think the most credible account came from the FBI agent who interrogated Saddam at the end. And he wrote a book about it. I forgot his name. I think he's Lebanese American. And Saddam told him, he said, I lived for 64 years, which is more than the average life of the Iraqi individual. He ruled the country for a long time, and he was satisfied, and he was ready to die. He wasn't afraid to die, because he basically did whatever he had to do. Plus, his presence in court and the way he was defiant, he made a stamp, definitely.
Like it was the last scene of his life, and he
Yes.
had to be a hero.
Yes.
So, but also you were looking in that period to create like backstories, to find maybe human stories. Can you tell us more about this era, and what do you still have as engraved in your memory from this period of time?
I mean, during the Saddam, it's so sad because, we work for foreign media and our access to Iraq was very limited. To be honest, you show up in Iraq, you have to stay at a certain hotel. Our drivers reported on us. Every time we had to go and do something, we had to take permission, we had to take a guide or what's called a minder from the ministry. And there was this feeling that, they call it, reporting from the belly of the beast. But the beast was not that harmful. Why? Because, the people who looked after us and watched over us, they were not so very sophisticated, and most of them were practically poor, especially, so it was very easy just to buy them a sandwich, and then they would turn the other way, which was sad, But what we were not allowed to do was talking to ordinary Iraqis. The mother who was afraid that her son is going to war. We had no access to that. We were encouraged to talk to the people who were like, oh, we're going to fight, we're going to kill the Americans, and that was not the Iraqi people. That was, people who were just behaving in front of a camera, expectedly, because, there'd be other people watching over them. And it was sad, we were not allowed to have access to this, what the average Iraqi, Muhammad would tell you, or his mother, or how they lived and how they suffered. And in a way, that served, the Iraqi people bad, because the people in the West, the Western audience, saw Iraq as a bunch of hooligans carrying guns and shouting and screaming and swearing that they're going to come and kill the Americans. And that was not Iraq. That was the image that the regime encouraged to show. And unfortunately, a lot of the foreign journalists, this is what they had to show. And that's what they were allowed to show.
Amjad, the first time we met, you shared with me a lot of stories, and I kept some of them in my mind.
Wow.
And I wish we have all the time to talk about them.
I can make you wait for 3 hours.
I know. But since you started working in the field, you've witnessed a lot of events happening in the region. Which one event impacted you the most, and which other than Saddam, a political leader or personality from the region impacted you the most? It can be negative or positive, it doesn't matter.
Well, that's a very tricky question. Okay, I think the most impactful thing I've seen, we were taken inside Abu Ghraib after the war, when the American soldiers were there, and they took us to the execution chamber in Abu Ghraib. And for me, that was a very eerie moment, especially when we saw what we saw. There were no prisoners there, but you could see what was going on there. And it was sad. It's absolutely sad. They had 2 gallows. In one room, they used to execute people two at a time. And then you see the holding cells next to the execution chamber where they kept the prisoners before they put them to death. And that was, for me, you get nightmares watching that. Seeing it, and the people, they had these writings on the wall, and it was sad. That, for me, probably one of the saddest things I've seen in my life. And, I'm happy that I saw it, but it was just so telling about the suffering of ordinary people. Now, as far as leaders, we interviewed a lot of leaders throughout the time. One guy that was pretty impressive was actually Saif al-Islam al-Gaddafi, the son of Gaddafi.
Another controversial personality.
Yes, very controversial, very, very controversial. And I think Saif al-Islam, basically, he was wasn't educated. He went to LSE or something, and supposedly somebody wrote his thesis, but maybe not. Who knows? LSE says no. He deserves his master's or his doctorate, whatever they gave him. And he was very sophisticated. Saif al-Islam was very sophisticated in a country that was just absolutely crazy, And I think they realized at some point that the country needs to be changed. The problem is that was his father listening to him, or could he have done it? What he did in his last days, they built up this very modern airline, Al-Afriqiyya. I don't remember. And it was it was like, wow, it's a very, very, very good airline, beautiful crew, beautiful brand new planes, good entertainment system. The whole thing was run online. You could do booking online. And you're talking about this 10 years ago now, even more. And when we used to interview him, the guy was very impressive, actually, and he knew what he was talking about. But at the same time, the whole thing was crazy. And when the demonstrations started to happen in Tripoli, of course, every Thursday or Friday, they used to cut off the internet. And imagine an airline running online when the internet goes out. Chaos at the airport, because they couldn't do ticketing. They had to go back to write tickets, handwritten tickets. So yes, he was in a way impressive. I'm not saying he's a nice guy or anything, but I think he had something to
exceeded your expectations.
Exceeded your expectations, yes.
Amjad, we have to tell our viewers that you have won many awards. And in 2016, you won an Emmy Award for your investigative piece on the chemical attacks in Syria.
Yes.
How difficult was it to put facts together? And for those who did not watch the episode of 60 Minutes, what were the main conclusions you got?
Well, Syria is a very unique case for media coverage. And the reason is when the war started, at the beginning, or the war, the civil conflict, call it whatever you want, because even the naming, the events in Syria is a very highly politically charged statement. Foreign journalists, they had two ways to cover Syria, either to go through Damascus and getting visas and so on, which means that they have to be subjected to Syrian government regulation, or coming through the opposition and go through Turkey and so on. And then at that time, ISIS or their predecessors started kidnapping them. So most of the journalists actually did not cover Syria, and a lot of the coverage came from people like us sitting, in Turkey or in Jordan or in Lebanon, getting news secondhand. And at that time, mobile phones started to be prevalent. People they could film with their phones. So at the beginning of the conflict, Syria was covered by citizen journalists, which is great. So, but citizen journalists are not journalists. They are individuals who are trying to do something. And I always classify them, they come in three categories. They are mercenaries, missionaries, or misfits, which means that they are, they have a case, a story that they want to tell, and that they are missionaries, they want to
devoted,
dedicated. Or they are mercenaries, somebody paid them to do whatever they want to do. Or they are misfits, people like most of us who wants to go on Facebook and get likes. Just majaneen. So these are the three types of categories. I'm not denying their role and their importance and their sacrifices.
But as you said, they are not trained.
But this is what they are. Okay.
Yes, exactly.
And I always say those people, they speak, but they need an interpreter. Somebody has to interpret all these tweets and videos and whatever are coming out of the country and try to make sense out of this. And that was the role of traditional or proper journalists to do that. So with all this media confusion, it was very hard to cover Syria, and especially the Syrian government, aided by the Russians, masterminded the disinformation campaigns. So when you get a story out of Syria, you usually get 6 different versions. Okay, 3 by Russia Today, 1 by Sputnik, 1 by the BBC, and 1 I don't know what. And the ordinary audience, okay, who shall we believe? Okay, so when it became, the story became more deadly with the chemical gas attacks, who do you believe? And this is very, very, very hard to do. So we covered the particular event, which was the attack on Khan Sheikhoun, and we covered it from Turkey. And we used a lot of videos that were given to us by opposition figures, and we had to make up our mind if this story is true or not, and which is very hard to do because nobody was there. But if you talk to a lot of people, talk to the people in the videos, try to trace them, hear their stories, hear somebody else, you can put the story together. So I firmly believe that there was an attack on Khan Sheikhoun on that day, and people died. Okay, how many people died now? No one knows. Okay, now the Russians and Syrian government said, well, they put out 3 different stories. First they said there was no attack. This was all filmed in Hollywood. There's another story about that the opposition or ISIS left some chemicals in the city that exploded and killed the people. And there was another story. And there's a story that the people were talking about. So at the end, we managed to find a Syrian guy living in a refugee camp in Turkey. And we found him ourselves. And he told us what happened. He told us his story. And the story was that he lived in Khan Sheikhoun, and at that time, whenever there was an air raid, most of the Syrians in the opposition areas had sirens or some devices that used to beep, like there's a plane coming, get ready. So their thing bleeped. I don't know what they call them. So when it bleeped,
like an alarm or something.
Like an alarm. And then, when the plane comes, usually they hear an explosion.
Yeah.
That day, they didn't hear an explosion. They heard a thump. So he went out from his house to see what is going on outside, and then he fell on the ground, and 3 days later, he wakes up in a hospital in Turkey. So this is what he knows. But what he also knows, that two of his sons are dead, okay? And he now is living in Turkey, him, his wife, the 2 widows of his children, and 11 grandchildren. And they're all there. Okay, we saw them. We talked to them one by one, and they all tell the same kind of story. So you cannot deny the existence of this person. He's there. I have a picture of him. Okay, okay. Now, how credible is his story? I don't think you can make it up. I mean, it sounds credible. Now, where is the chemical that came to, kill them or whatever? Okay, now we start to argue. There was an airplane now, but okay, but also there was evidence from the NATO, that there was a plane that took off at a specific hour, because they can monitor these things, that went and came back. Okay, so I think overall this story is true. Okay. Now it's very easy for somebody to come and start shooting at you, like, oh, this is not true, this is kizib, this is not. And it's like, okay, give me the alternative story that's credible. Nobody comes with an alternative story that's credible. People are very good at finding little holes in your story and say, okay, this is wrong, which means the whole story is wrong. Okay, what is the alternative? How does this guy ended up in that? This could not have been, filmed in Hollywood. The guy is real. He's there.
Amjad, we're almost out of time,
Yes.
but I would like to ask one more question, and if you can be a bit brief. In 2016, you got the Emmy Award, but before that, 3 years before that, you started Syria Direct.
Yes.
You co-founded Syria Direct here in Jordan to support Syrian journalists, and at the time, and to cover what's happening in Syria. But at the time, the Syrian media was booming, and in 2015 was the peak. Now, after the re-election of Bashar al-Assad, what do you think is the fate of the Syrian media?
You mean the Syrian media
alternative
the
media?
Alternative media?
Yeah.
Well, that's a very good question. In fact, last week we had a retreat for the office to see where the future goes. Listen, the problem with Syria, again, I always maintain, had there been free media in Syria before the revolution, the revolution would not have happened.
Yeah.
Seriously, when you have free media, people who can, expose corruption, expose problems, talk about it, allow people to express their point of view, you don't need a revolution.
Yeah.
But Syria had none of that. They had, the only thing they had state media that ran propaganda.
Yeah.
Okay, and then there was a huge need, for journalists, for serious journalism. And when we started Syria Direct, the reason we started it was to train Syrians how to report the news, because they had no idea about it, none whatsoever. With few exceptions, but the most. People were not used to listen to news coverage, because they expect you as a journalist to be opinionated, to have a point of view, and they don't understand that we journalists should not have a point of view. We are just there to report what we see, and that was a very foreign concept to them. So this is what we started. Now at the beginning of the revolution, the civil war, whatever, the Syrians who worked for us, by the mere fact that they're refugees, they didn't like the regime, they were opposition. And we had to make sure always, all the time, to explain to them, your politics outside the office. Here we do news. We don't do opinions. And it took time, and then we had, non-Syrians who actually made sure that our news is balanced. So, and that took an effort. It's very hard to be neutral. It's very easy to take sides. It's hard to be neutral. So, but at the beginning, they were very happy to work, and report, because the opposition at that time were winning the war.
Yeah.
And then one day, the guy who ran the office called me up and said, Amjad, we have a problem. And he said, what? He said, the morale in the office is very, very low. I said, why? I said, because now, the regime is winning the war.
Yeah.
So, and I went in and I told them, listen, guys, the story has changed, but still our mission is the same. We have to report the news, even if you don't like it. Before, we used to report news that you like. Now we have to report the news that you don't like. But we still have to do it, day in, day out. And that was very, very hard. Okay, and now what we go further, the problem is that the world itself is fed up with Syria. There's what's called Syria fatigue. The donors are fed up with Syria.
Yes.
The story is not going anywhere. but it doesn't mean that we have to stop coverage.
Exactly.
And that's a very, very hard thing to do.
The story continues.
Yeah.
Amjad, you produce 60 minutes. I want to ask you a question for 60-second answer.
Yeah.
What are the directions you have? What are the recommendations for people who want to work in journalism to stay objective and to try as much as they can to cover the truth as it is?
I mean, it's, again, I've been taught by, very, very seasoned journalists and so on. At the end of the day, we are people. We have opinions. We have points of view. You cannot bring somebody and say, okay, you have to be neutral. People have to have a point of view by the mere fact that, we read, we understand, and so on. To be neutral is very, very hard. But at the end of the day, if you are not neutral, you go nowhere. I'm one of the few journalists in the world who actually interviewed Mohammed bin Salman and Sheikh Tamim during the Gulf Rift. Because, and why we could do that? Because people know that we are a credible news organization, that we don't take sides. Had we taken sides with X against Y or against Z, you only have access to one side of the story. You don't have access to both sides of the story. And actually, this is the biggest proof that we are in the middle. Because we don't take sides. We are not pro Mohammed bin Salman. We are not against Mohammed bin Salman. We are not pro Tamim. We are not against Tamim. We just went there and asked him the right questions, and he gave us his version of the truth or whatever he wants to tell us. And it's our duty as journalists to report it, even if we don't like it. The worst thing for me sometimes is to go and interview somebody that I don't like, that I don't agree with, but I still have to report what he says.
Thank you so much. At the end of our discussion, Yara would like to offer you a small gift.
Yeah, this is the Now House memory game. I know you live in Amman, you're Jordanian, but it's more like a way for you to discover the landmarks of Amman.
It's Amman. Okay, wow.
Yeah.
Very nice.
And thank you a lot for joining us here in the Now House.
Yes, and we see you soon, hopefully.
All right.
And hopefully we'll see everyone in the next season of MENA on the Map.
Thank you.